are not waiting for a sign. The sign already happened. You just stopped reacting long enough to notice it. Something shifted before you had words for it. Not as an event, not as a moment you could point to. It did not arrive with intensity or emotion. It arrived as a pause so ordinary that your mind almost dismissed it. No urgency, no push, no internal voice telling you what this meant. And that is why it matters, because the sign you were waiting for was never meant to interrupt your life. It was meant to remove the pressure that kept interrupting you from within. For a long time, your attention was always leaning forward, trying to predict, trying to understand, trying to confirm that you were moving in the right direction. Every time it leaned forward, reality blurred. Not because life was unclear, but because you were interfering before it had time to respond. Now something is different. You may not feel excited. You may not feel inspired. You may even feel unsure whether anything changed at all. That uncertainty is not a problem. It is the absence of forcing. The moment attention stops demanding proof, something subtle becomes possible. Reality no longer has to shout. It no longer has to shock you into awareness. It can speak quietly, and quiet information only becomes audible when you are no longer reacting to fill the silence. You did not become more focused. You became less reactive. That difference changes everything. Focus still carries tension. Reaction still carries urgency. But what is happening now carries neither. You are not trying to hold a state. You are not trying to stay calm. You are not trying to maintain clarity. You simply stopped interfering long enough for coherence to stabilize on its own. This is why the sign did not feel like a sign. Signs that need to be recognized usually come too late. They appear when you are already off balance. This one appeared when you stopped leaning. You may notice that you are no longer checking where you are on the path, not because you arrived somewhere, but because the need to locate yourself dropped away. When that question disappears without being answered, something fundamental has shifted. Not in knowledge, in posture. You are standing differently inside your own awareness. And from that position, reality responds in a different way, not with answers, with alignment, not with promises, with removal. Things that once pulled at you now feel oddly flat, not wrong, just empty of energy. Choices that once demanded analysis now resolve themselves before thought begins, not because you became decisive, but because the noise that created confusion is no longer present. This is not intuition as most people describe it. It is not a feeling. It is not a message. It is the absence of distortion. When the observer stops collapsing under expectation, reality can finally be seen as it is. And what is real does not need explanation. This is why there is no urge to act immediately, no desire to take notes, no impulse to turn this into a practice. If you felt that urge, the field would already be unstable again. The clarity you are touching does not ask to be used. It asks to be left alone. And that may feel unfamiliar, because most change you have known required effort, required doing, required proving. This does not. It asks only one thing, that you do not rush to conclude. When you do not conclude, attention stays open without fragmenting. When attention stays open, coherence holds. When coherence holds, reality adjusts without resistance. This adjustment is not dramatic, it is precise. It shows up as stopping earlier, choosing less, speaking fewer words with more accuracy. You may think you are becoming more ordinary, less driven, less intense. In truth, you are becoming aligned, and alignment does not feel like victory. It feels like not needing to fight yourself anymore. If you expected a sign that would tell you something important happened, you missed the point. Important shifts do not announce themselves. They remove the need for announcement. The moment you no longer need to ask whether something changed is the moment it already did. Nothing new was added to you. Nothing was activated. Nothing arrived from outside. What changed is simpler than that. You stopped reacting long enough for reality to speak back. And once you hear that kind of response, you do not need another sign, because you are no longer waiting. There is a phase that feels strangely unremarkable. No major event, no emotional surge, no moment you can point to and say, this is when everything changed. Life continues, work continues, conversations continue, yet something inside you no longer moves the same way. You wake up without the same internal push, not tired, not unmotivated, just quieter. You notice that you do not rush to explain yourself anymore. You do not rehearse your thoughts as much before speaking. You do not feel the same need to justify why you are doing what you are doing. And that unsettles you. Because for a long time, movement was driven by pressure to improve, pressure to stay on track, pressure to make sure you are becoming someone. Now that pressure is gone. And without it, you wonder what is guiding you. You may look around and think that nothing is happening. No breakthrough, no collapse, no obvious sign of progress. But inside, the constant pulling has softened. You are not trying to prove that you understand something. You are not collecting explanations to feel safe. You are not searching for confirmation in conversations or content. And this absence feels unfamiliar. You may catch yourself thinking that you should feel more, that there should be clarity, excitement, certainty, that if something real were happening, it would announce itself more loudly. But it does not. Instead, you find that you stop checking where you stand. You stop measuring your state. You stop asking whether you are doing enough. Not because you decided to stop, but because the questions no longer carry urgency. This is where confusion appears. Because much of what you once called growth came with effort. It came with tension. It came with a sense that if you did not keep moving, you would fall behind. Now you are moving less, and yet you are not stuck. You may feel as though you lost the drive that once pushed you forward, but what actually disappeared was the fear that kept you moving. Fear of being wrong, fear of wasting time, fear of missing something important. Without that fear, your inner landscape feels empty at first. Not empty in a peaceful way, empty in a neutral way. There is nothing to chase, nothing to fix, nothing demanding your immediate attention. And because you are not used to this, you may mistake it for stagnation. You may tell yourself that you are becoming passive, that you are losing ambition, that something is fading instead of forming. But notice this, you are not drifting. You are not numbing out. You are not avoiding life. You are simply not being pulled. When a conversation no longer fits, you feel it sooner. When a decision does not align, you pause without forcing yourself to choose. When something drains you, you stop earlier without guilt. These are not dramatic changes. They do not create stories. They do not ask for recognition. And that is precisely why they feel confusing. You were taught to measure change by intensity, by emotion, by visible markers. This phase offers none of that. It offers subtlety. You may notice that you speak less about the future, not because you have no vision, but because you no longer need to live ahead of time to feel secure. You may notice that silence feels less threatening. Moments without stimulation no longer demand to be filled. You are still thinking, you are still feeling, but those movements no longer take over. This is why the phase feels so quiet. The voice that once narrated every step has softened. And without that narration, you feel exposed. You are no longer telling yourself where you are going. You are no longer reminding yourself who you are becoming. And without those reminders, you wonder if you are losing direction. But direction does not always feel like movement. Sometimes it feels like stability. Sometimes it feels like not needing to push. You may notice that you consume less information, not out of discipline, but because you are not trying to fill a gap. Advice no longer pulls you the way it used to. Perspectives no longer feel urgent. You are not closed. You are complete enough not to search. This completeness is fragile at first, not because it is weak, but because you are not used to trusting it. You keep waiting for something to disrupt it, for doubt to return, for anxiety to reappear. And when it does, you notice something else. The reaction is smaller, the story shorter, the recovery quicker. This is not a loss of depth. It is a reduction of noise. You are not becoming less engaged with life. You are becoming less entangled with it. And that distinction is easy to miss because entanglement often feels like care, like responsibility, like commitment, but much of it was tension. Now that tension is loosening, and as it loosens, you are left without the familiar signals that once told you who you were. That is why this phase feels strange. Not because something is wrong, but because something that once defined you is no longer needed. You are not meant to understand this phase. Understanding would immediately turn it into something to hold. You are meant to notice it and let it remain ordinary. Because the most reliable shifts rarely feel like transformations. They feel like returning to a pace that no longer asks you to hurry. And if you recognize yourself in this quiet, if you see your own experience reflected here, then you are not missing anything. You are simply standing in a place where nothing needs to be proven anymore. And that is why it feels unfamiliar. Reality does not respond to emotion. It does not respond to effort. It does not respond to desire. It responds to stability. This is the part most people never hear clearly. Not because it is hidden, but because it contradicts how they have been trained to move through life. From an early age, you learned that more intensity creates more results, more focus, more discipline, more pressure applied in the right direction. That logic works in linear systems. It works when force produces output. It works when effort accumulates. But observation does not work that way. When reality is responding to the state of the observer, effort becomes interference. The moment you try to understand too quickly, attention tightens. The moment you try to hold a conclusion, awareness narrows. The moment you try to confirm that something is happening, presence contracts. Each contraction destabilizes the field. You may still appear calm on the surface. Your breathing may still be steady. Your posture may still look composed. But inside, the observer has leaned forward. And when the observer leans forward, reality stops responding clearly. This is not punishment. It is mechanics. A stable observational field requires one condition only: that the observer does not interfere with its own process. Interference does not have to be dramatic. It is usually subtle. A thought that arrives too early, an urge to label what is happening, a need to decide what this means for you. Each of these movements seems harmless. Each feels responsible. Each feels like awareness. But together, they introduce noise. Noise is not chaos. Noise is distortion. It bends the signal just enough that clarity cannot form. This is why so many people feel that life is sending mixed messages. It is not that reality is unclear. It is that the observer is unstable. The moment you try to extract meaning before the response is complete, the field collapses. The moment you try to hold on to a feeling to make sure it stays, the moment you try to measure progress, the field collapses. Not because you did something wrong, but because observation was replaced by control. Control always creates tension, even gentle control, and tension is enough to disrupt coherence. Reality does not respond to how much you want something. It responds to how steadily you can remain present without pulling. This is why effort often produces the opposite result in inner work. The more you try to reach clarity, the more it moves away. The more you try to stabilize yourself, the more fragile you become, because you are building stability on effort instead of foundation. A stable observer does not need to hold itself together. It is held by the absence of interference. When you stop trying to understand, clarity organizes itself. When you stop trying to conclude, information arrives whole. When you stop trying to confirm, response becomes precise. This does not mean you become passive. It means you stop inserting yourself between reality and its feedback. Most people believe they are observing when they are actually reacting to discomfort, reacting to uncertainty, reacting to silence. They fill the space too quickly. They explain too early. They move before the signal completes. And then they wonder why nothing feels aligned. Alignment does not require action. It requires stillness without tension, not stillness of the body, stillness of interference. The observer does not need to disappear. It needs to stop collapsing. Collapse happens whenever attention fragments, pulled forward by expectation, pulled backward by memory, pulled sideways by comparison. Each pull splits the field, and a split field cannot receive clean information. When stability appears, the change is immediate but quiet. You are not flooded with insight. You are not overwhelmed with emotion. You simply stop being pulled. This is why the reveal does not feel dramatic, because drama requires instability. The truth operates without intensity. It does not convince. It does not persuade. It reorganizes, and reorganization is subtle. You begin to notice that you no longer rush to answer questions, not because you do not care, but because you trust the response to arrive. You begin to notice that decisions no longer feel heavy, not because they are easy, but because secondary motives are no longer interfering. You begin to notice that some paths quietly close, not through conflict, but through loss of energy. This is the field responding to stability. Nothing was activated, nothing was added, nothing was given. The only thing that changed is that the observer stopped interfering long enough for reality to complete its response. And once you see this, you stop trying to do something with it, because doing would immediately disturb it again. Stability is not something you achieve. It is something that remains when effort falls away. Reality does not need you to be intense. It needs you to be steady. And steadiness appears the moment you stop trying to force clarity into existence. When the observer holds its place without leaning, collapsing ends. When collapsing ends, response becomes clean. When response becomes clean, nothing else needs to be explained. That is the core truth, and it does not ask you to believe it. It simply operates whenever you stop getting in the way. Clarity does not increase when you concentrate harder. That belief is deeply ingrained. It feels logical. If something is unclear, you apply more focus. If direction is missing, you narrow attention and push forward. But this is where the paradox begins. The more you try to focus, the more tension you introduce. The more tension you introduce, the less stable the field becomes. And the less stable the field becomes, the more distorted the response. This is not obvious at first, because effort feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like taking control. Yet control is precisely what destabilizes observation. When you concentrate with intent, attention contracts. It narrows to exclude uncertainty. It tries to hold one line of meaning while pushing everything else away. That narrowing may feel sharp. It may feel productive, but it fragments the field. Clarity does not emerge from fragmentation. It emerges from coherence, and coherence cannot be forced. This is why people who try hardest to stay clear often feel the most unstable inside. They are constantly adjusting, constantly correcting, constantly monitoring whether they are still in the right state. Each adjustment introduces a micro-tension. Each correction signals that something is wrong. Each check pulls attention out of its foundation. Nothing collapses dramatically, but everything becomes noisy. The paradox is that clarity appears when there is no longer a reason to lose stability, not because you did something right, but because you stopped doing what was interfering. You stopped tightening attention. You stopped leaning forward internally. You stopped demanding that reality respond on your timeline. And when that pressure disappears, something subtle reorganizes itself. You are not holding a state. You are not maintaining calm. You are not reminding yourself how to be. There is nothing to protect, nothing to preserve, nothing to sustain through effort. This absence of effort is not laziness. It is precision. Precision does not rush. It does not force. It waits without tension. Most people associate waiting with lack, with uncertainty, with fear of missing out. But this waiting is different. It is not waiting for something to arrive. It is allowing what is already forming to complete. When you are no longer afraid of losing clarity, clarity stabilizes. When you are no longer trying to keep yourself together, coherence holds. Fear of loss is one of the quietest sources of instability. You may not feel it as fear. It often appears as discipline. You tell yourself to stay aware, to stay grounded, to stay aligned. Each instruction pulls attention away from its natural base and places it inside a framework of control. Control feels safe, but safety built on control is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. It must be monitored. It must be defended. And anything that must be defended cannot remain stable. When you stop trying to hold a state, the state no longer needs holding. When you stop guarding clarity, clarity becomes ordinary. When you stop fearing collapse, collapse loses its power. This is why the response from reality becomes so quiet. It no longer needs to compete with your internal noise. It no longer needs to interrupt your effort. It can respond with minimal signal. Minimal does not mean weak. It means undistorted. You begin to notice changes that are easy to miss. A sense that certain directions no longer pull at you. A feeling that some conversations end earlier without tension. A recognition that some decisions no longer require internal debate. These are not dramatic shifts. They do not demand attention. They simply fit. And because they fit, they do not excite the mind. The mind looks for intensity to validate reality. It looks for emotion to confirm importance. But importance in this field is measured by accuracy, not by volume. Accuracy feels calm. It feels clean. It feels almost boring. This is why many people doubt this phase. They think they are losing depth. They think they are becoming less alive. In truth, they are becoming less distorted. Distortion thrives on urgency, on the need to act, on the need to conclude. When urgency drops, distortion has no fuel. You may notice that you no longer remind yourself who you are supposed to be. You no longer rehearse identity. You no longer correct your reactions in real time. This does not mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped interfering. Interference always comes from a good intention, to improve, to protect, to ensure progress. But progress in this domain is not linear. It is subtractive. Each layer of interference removed reveals clarity that was already there. You do not become clearer by adding focus. You become clearer by removing the need to focus. You do not become stable by holding yourself steady. You become stable when there is no force pulling you off balance. This is the heart of the paradox. When you try to be clear, you introduce tension. When you allow clarity to remain unforced, tension dissolves. Reality responds to this dissolution immediately, not with answers, with alignment. Alignment shows up as simplicity, fewer options that matter, fewer paths that call for energy, not because your world shrank, but because noise fell away. You may feel that life slowed down, but what slowed was unnecessary movement that existed only to manage inner instability. Now action feels cleaner. You can act without overthinking. You can pause without guilt. Effort becomes precise. You can work hard without inner resistance. You can stop without feeling that you failed. This precision is not something you generate. It appears when pressure leaves. Pressure always comes from the idea that something must be maintained, a state, an identity, a direction. When that idea dissolves, reality no longer needs to push back. It begins to respond softly, through loss of attraction, through early friction, through quiet confirmation. These responses are easy to ignore if you are looking for signs, but if you are no longer searching, they become obvious. You do not have to interpret them. You recognize them immediately. Recognition does not feel like excitement. It feels like relief without drama. Relief that you no longer have to manage yourself. This is why clarity increases when you stop trying to be clear. Because clarity was never missing, only obscured. The moment you stop creating reasons to lose stability, stability becomes natural. And when stability is natural, Reality has nothing to fight against. It does not need to push. It does not need to block. It does not need to correct you forcefully. It can respond lightly, precisely, on time. That is the paradox at the center of quantum vault. Not doing more, not trying harder, not focusing deeper, but removing the conditions that made clarity fragile. When you stop making yourself the manager of the process organizes itself. And when it does so quietly that you may only notice it when you realize you are no longer struggling to stay where you already are. The sign of a new threshold is not intensity. It is the disappearance of impulse. No rush to define what is happening. No urge to capture the moment. No pressure to make sense of it before it settles. The question that once followed you quietly fades. Where am I on the path? What stage is this? Am I moving forward or standing still? It does not get answered. It dissolves. And when a question falls away without resistance, without leaving anxiety behind, it means it has finished its work. This is where the breakthrough happens. Not as a realization, not as insight, but as relief. Relief from needing to locate yourself. For a long time, clarity appeared as something you reached, a peak, a moment when things aligned and you finally felt certain, and just as quickly, it slipped away. You tried to hold it, you tried to repeat it, you tried to understand how it happened so you could return. Each attempt turned clarity into effort. Each effort turned it fragile. Now, clarity no longer behaves that way. It is no longer something you enter and exit. It does not come with excitement or fear of loss. It does not require maintenance. It becomes the ground you are standing on. And ground does not feel dramatic. It feels stable. You notice that you no longer need to check your inner state. You are not scanning yourself for signs that you are still aligned. You are not correcting emotions as they arise. Thoughts still appear. Feelings still move. But they no longer pull you out of position. They pass through rather than carry you with them. This is the difference that changes everything. When clarity is a peak, life feels like a series of climbs and falls. When clarity is the ground, life becomes continuous. Nothing special needs to happen for you to remain steady. Nothing needs to be avoided. Nothing needs to be protected. You stop fearing regression because there is no state to lose. This absence of fear creates a new kind of confidence. Not confidence in yourself, confidence in stability. You trust that even when confusion appears, it will not take over. Even when emotion rises, it will pass. Even when uncertainty returns, it will not collapse the foundation. And because of this trust, you no longer rush to resolve anything. You let questions remain open without discomfort. You allow situations to unfold without forcing direction. This does not make you passive. It makes you precise. Precision does not require certainty. It requires timing. You begin to notice that decisions come later but land better. You speak less but with more accuracy. You act without needing to convince yourself first. The need to narrate your process disappears. You are no longer building a story about who you are becoming. You are no longer collecting meaning to justify where you stand. This silence around your inner life may feel strange at first. You are used to translating everything into understanding, used to sharing, used to validating your experience through explanation. Now, explanation feels unnecessary. Not because you lack insight, but because insight no longer asks to be expressed. It completes itself. This is why you do not feel the need to tell anyone. Not because you are hiding something, but because nothing is unfinished. Experiences that require retelling usually leave residue. They need confirmation to stay real. This one does not. It settles into behavior rather than language. You stop earlier when something drains you. You do not push through misalignment to prove resilience. You change direction without drama. These choices feel obvious rather than heroic. They do not create pride. They do not create regret. They simply fit. You may notice that you care less about being right, less about being seen as aware, less about maintaining an image of growth, Not because you lost depth, but because identity loosened. When identity loosens, comparison loses its grip. You stop measuring yourself against others. You stop wondering if you are ahead or behind. Those questions no longer apply. You are not above the process. You are inside it. This inside position changes how effort feels. You can still work intensely. You can still focus deeply, but effort no longer carries tension. When you stop, there is no crash. When you rest, there is no guilt. Energy flows where it is needed and withdraws where it is not. This flow does not need management. It is one of the clearest signs that clarity has become foundational. Another sign appears quietly. Time feels different, not slower, not faster, more available. You are no longer racing against it. You are no longer planning far ahead to feel safe. You take the step that fits now, and that is enough. This does not remove ambition. It removes urgency. Urgency was never drive. It was anxiety disguised as movement. When urgency fades, movement becomes cleaner, more accurate, less wasteful. You may still not know where everything is going, but you no longer need to. The future no longer demands rehearsal. This is often mistaken for lack of vision. In reality, vision becomes flexible. It responds to information as it arrives rather than forcing a predetermined shape. The breakthrough is not that you finally understand something important. It is that you no longer need understanding to feel stable. Not knowing becomes lighter. Open spaces no longer create tension. And because there is no tension, awareness stays present. You are no longer observing yourself. Observing. You are simply here. This is why the breakthrough feels almost invisible. There is no announcement, no emotional high, no sense of achievement. If anything, there is a subtle sense of ordinariness. But this ordinariness is different from before. Before, ordinary life felt heavy. It required constant adjustment, constant interpretation. Now it feels simpler, not easier, simpler, less inner commentary, less self-correction, less effort spent on staying aligned. Alignment takes care of itself. You begin to trust that when something no longer fits, you will feel it early, that you will not need to wait for collapse to change direction. This trust does not come from belief. It comes from repeated experience. Each time you remain still long enough, information arrives. Each time you do not rush, clarity follows. Not as an answer, as a shift in energy. And because these shifts are small, they accumulate quietly, one choice at a time, one pause at a time, one moment of not interfering. Over time, you realize something fundamental. You are no longer chasing clarity. You are living from it. And when clarity becomes the ground, not the goal, the journey no longer needs to be tracked. It continues, but without the weight of proving that it is moving. That is the breakthrough. Not a moment you remember, but a way of standing that no longer asks for confirmation. Clarity does not rise above life anymore. It runs through it, unannounced, undramatic, stable enough that nothing needs to be added. And when nothing needs to be added, nothing is missing. That is how, the threshold has been crossed. Not because something happened, but because nothing is pushing you to ask whether it did. From this ground, changes begin to appear in the most ordinary places. Not where you expected transformation to show itself. Not in ideas or insights, but in how everyday choices settle without resistance. A decision that once kept you awake now resolves quietly. Not because you analyzed it better, not because you finally found the right argument, but because the internal pull that created confusion is no longer there. You look at the options, and one simply fits. The others do not. There is no debate, no inner negotiation, no need to convince yourself. The clarity does not feel impressive. It feels obvious. This is one of the first anchors into real life. When choice stops feeling heavy, not every decision becomes easy, but fewer decisions become complicated. You notice this especially in areas where you once overthought: career direction, creative projects, commitments you kept revisiting. The moment the noise leaves, indecision loses its grip. Not because you are more confident, but because doubt had always been fueled by interference. Without that interference, options reveal their true weight. Another change appears in movement. Paths that once felt exciting now feel flat. Not wrong, not disappointing, just empty of momentum. You may try to re-engage them out of habit, but the energy does not return. There is nothing to fight against, nothing to push through. The attraction is gone. This absence can feel unsettling at first. You were used to struggle being part of direction. You thought resistance meant importance. Now resistance fades earlier. Before you invest months of effort, before you build narratives around endurance. This is not loss of ambition. It is early feedback. Reality is responding faster because the signal is clear. You also notice this shift in relationships, not through conflict, not through dramatic endings, but through timing. Conversations that once stretched on now end sooner, not because something went wrong, but because there is nothing left to sustain them. You do not feel the need to explain yourself. You do not feel guilty for stepping back. You do not rehearse what you should have said. You simply stop, and the stopping feels clean. Where you once stayed too long to avoid discomfort, you now sense misalignment earlier. You exit gently, without resentment, without self-justification. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional accuracy. The noise that kept you entangled is no longer present to amplify reactions. You may notice that you apologize less for being honest, not because you are harsher, but because honesty no longer carries tension. When you say no, it is quieter. When you say yes, it is simpler. This simplicity is one of the clearest signs that clarity has anchored itself into daily life. Another shift appears in effort. You still work, you still focus, you still invest energy, but effort no longer feels like pushing against something invisible. You can work deeply and stop without exhaustion. You can rest without needing recovery. This tells you something important. Your actions are moving with the current rather than against it. Before, much of your energy was spent correcting yourself, adjusting, monitoring, trying to stay aligned. Now alignment sustains itself. You do not wake up planning how to manage your inner state. You enter the day and respond. Responsiveness replaces strategy. This responsiveness shows up in small practical ways. You reply to messages more slowly but more clearly. You schedule less and accomplish more. You stop filling time to avoid silence. You allow space without trying to optimize it. Silence no longer feels like a gap that must be closed. It feels like room. This room allows something important to happen. You begin to notice friction sooner, not as failure, as information. When a task feels heavy from the start, you pause. When a conversation drains you quickly, you pay attention. You no longer push through friction to prove discipline. You listen to it. Listening does not mean avoiding challenge. It means not confusing resistance with value. Friction that appears early saves you time. It prevents deep investment in misaligned directions. This changes how you relate to responsibility. You are not carrying everything to the breaking point anymore. You adjust earlier, more gently, with less loss. This is another anchor into real life, the ability to change lanes without drama. You may also notice a shift in how you relate to information. You consume less, not because you decided to be disciplined, but because you are not trying to fill uncertainty. Advice no longer pulls at you the way it once did. Perspectives feel optional rather than necessary. You trust your foundation enough to wait. When information is useful, it lands. When it is noise, it passes. Discernment becomes quiet. Another everyday sign appears in emotion. You still feel nothing is suppressed, but emotions move in proportion to events. Small things no longer trigger large reactions. A delay does not become a story. A mistake does not spread into self-judgment. Emotions arise. They pass. You do not manage them constantly. You let them self-regulate. This self-regulation happens naturally when they are not amplified by thought. You may notice that you recover faster, not because you are stronger, but because you are not dragging experiences forward. The past loses its grip sooner. This also affects how you speak about your life. You talk less about where you are going, less about who you are becoming, not because you lack direction, but because direction no longer needs narration. You are more present now, and from presence, the next step reveals itself when needed. You do not need to see far ahead to move accurately. Another subtle anchor appears in how you relate to others. You no longer feel the need to persuade. You no longer defend your choices. When alignment is present, explanation feels excessive. You stay when there is fit. You leave when there is not. Without drama, without justification, relationships become places of presence rather than validation. This does not distance you, it grounds you. People may notice that you are quieter, less reactive, more direct. They may not know what changed. You may not either, because the change did not happen at the level of identity. It happened at the level of noise. Noise withdrew. And when noise withdraws, life organizes itself in very practical ways. You stop later less often. You hesitate less before what is clear. You waste less energy on maintaining situations that no longer fit. None of this feels heroic. It feels normal. That is why it is easy to overlook. But this normality is different from before. Before, ordinary life required effort to hold together. Now it does not. Before, you constantly adjusted yourself to stay in motion. Now motion adjusts itself around you. This is the anchor, not a philosophy, not a belief. A lived shift in how daily life responds, not because you became more powerful, but because interference ended. When noise leaves, you do not gain something new. You gain accuracy. Accuracy in choice, accuracy in timing, accuracy in stopping, and accuracy changes everything without announcing itself. That is how you know clarity has moved out of thought and into life, not through big decisions, but through the ease with which small ones now settle. Not because you are stronger, but because there is less in the way. If you reach this point and there is no urge to do anything right now, no need to remember, no need to apply, no need to share, that is the signal, not because the process is finished, but because you are standing firmly enough that nothing needs to push you forward. Most messages try to move you. They tell you to act, to change, to improve. This one does not. Because movement that is forced always comes from instability, and instability always creates noise. What you are experiencing now does not need reinforcement. It does not need repetition. It does not need confirmation. If it did, it would already be fragile. You may notice a quiet temptation to turn this into something useful, to extract a lesson, to remember a key idea, to do something with it. That temptation is familiar. It once kept you moving, but notice how it no longer feels urgent. You can let it pass. Nothing is lost when you do. This is important to understand. When clarity is real, it does not demand action. It reorganizes behavior without instruction. You do not wake up with a new plan. You do not suddenly feel motivated. You simply move differently when the moment comes. That difference does not need explanation. If you try to hold it, it fades. If you try to remember it, it turns into memory. If you try to apply it, it becomes technique. And technique always pulls you back into effort. What is happening now operates without effort. This is why there is no call to act, no instruction to practice, no request to commit. Anything that asks you to hold on would already be out of alignment. Instead, something simpler remains. You are here, and here is enough. The observer is no longer collapsing under small fluctuations. Thoughts may still arise. Emotions may still move, but they no longer destabilize the field. And because the field is stable, reality does not need to raise its voice. It does not need dramatic events. It does not need strong emotions. It does not need signs that announce themselves. It responds quietly. Response does not look like reward. It looks like coordination. You find yourself at the right place without planning it. You notice the right moment without anticipating it. You stop before things drain you without needing justification. This coordination feels ordinary, reasonable, almost too simple to notice. That is how you know it is real. Anything that impresses the mind usually carries noise. Anything that needs excitement usually carries instability. This does not. It fits into life without disturbing it. You still live your life. You still make choices. You still face uncertainty, but you are no longer pushed by the need to be somewhere else. The pressure to arrive has eased. You may notice that time feels different now. Not slower, not faster, more available. You are no longer racing against it. You are no longer trying to get ahead of it. You respond when response is needed. You rest when rest is needed. Neither feels like failure. This is not because you learned something new. It is because you stopped interfering. Interference was never loud. It appeared as effort, as responsibility, as the need to stay on track. Now that need has loosened, and in that loosening, stability holds itself. This stability does not require protection. You do not need to maintain it. You do not need to monitor it. If you try, it will disappear, not as punishment, but because attention will have moved away from its foundation. So you let it be. You allow life to continue without adding commentary. You may still think, you may still plan, but planning no longer replaces presence. Presence remains primary, and from presence, the next step reveals itself when needed. You do not need to know what comes next to be where you are. This is the subtle shift most people miss. They are waiting for something that will make them certain. Certainty is not the marker here. Ease is. When something is aligned, it does not argue with you. It does not need persuasion. It does not need reassurance. It simply continues. If you feel that this message did not stimulate you, did not excite you, did not make you want to do more, that is not a failure. That is accuracy. It means nothing in you is being pulled unnecessarily. You are not being recruited into a process. You are not being pushed toward an identity. You are being left alone, and being left alone is often the clearest sign that the foundation is stable. From here, there is nothing to carry forward, no concept to remember, no insight to repeat. Life will test this quietly, not with challenges, but with small moments, a choice that asks for patience, a conversation that asks for honesty, a situation that asks you to stop earlier than before. You will not need to recall anything you heard. You will simply respond, and that response will feel natural. If you notice later that you move differently without trying, that you stopped sooner without regret, that you did less but with better timing, you will understand what this moment was without naming it. You will not think back to it as a turning point. You will not mark it as a beginning or an end. It will blend into how you live. That is how real shifts complete themselves. They do not ask to be remembered. They do not ask for acknowledgement. They ask only that you do not disturb them. And even if you do, nothing is broken. You simply stop interfering again, not to return to a state, but to return to the foundation that never moved. When the observer stops collapsing, reality no longer needs to shout. It simply responds, and response that does not shout does not compete for attention. It arrives, it organizes, it passes, leaving life simpler than before, not because you achieved something, but because nothing is in the way anymore. There is no final instruction here, no next step, only this: stay where you are without pushing, let life answer in its own time. And when it does, you will not need to ask whether it is real, because you will already be living the response.